Hi, and welcome to another Bible study. We are on Genesis 17 this week, and Genesis 17 is about God's covenant with Abraham, which you may be going, didn't we already talk about that? And we're going to get into that. But it also, for today, is helping us answer the question of what do we allow to shape our identity? So, in looking at this passage, chapter 17 is written by the priestly tradition. So, we may be going, didn't we talk about the covenant before? That's because that was written by the Yahwehist, the J tradition. So this is the priestly tradition's version of the covenant. And it's different. It's got some differences to it. And it's really important to remember, all right, what are the characteristics of a priestly author? Well, they're going to detail the whole thing about ceremonies and to recognize they have a particular way of thinking and doing things through how one orders their life. They're going to talk about sacrifices, festival days, ritual purity. And the priestly laws, they're meant to ensure survival of the people. They were concerned with the correct way of living. And so it's like neatly structured life. The goal here for the priestly writer, especially considering when the priestly writer is writing, which is far later than the J writer, it's to help the Israelites in exile to deal with the insecurities of exile, to respond to the loss of liberty and separation by providing some certainty. With Genesis 17, it's a complex priestly composition, including material from diverse sources, such as the Torah regarding circumcision. And the priestly writers who typically use the word Elohim for God, these writers in Genesis 17 are incorporating the name Yahweh here. So something kind of interesting about these particular writers. Again, the priestly writers are in the late Babylonian period of exile and then after exile. So we're looking at 550 to 450 BCE. So it also means it's like 500 years after the J writer. Some of the words translated here, which are important for just our understanding. One is we get a new name for God by God. And the new qualifier is El Shaddai. And can be translated as God Almighty. The thinking is it stems from early rabbinic times. El Shaddai appears 5 times in Genesis and Shaddai alone in chapter 49, verse 25. El Shaddai can also mean God, the one of the mountains. So that's kind of interesting when we think of like Mount Sinai and how God shows up. The priestly writer in Exodus characterizes El Shaddai as the name by which Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew how they know God. So that's kind of important going forward, that Isaac and Jacob are also going to recognize the God of Abraham, this El Shaddai, as their God. So just kind of to create some connection through the generations. Another word that gets translated here, depending upon what version of English you are, whether that's the New Revised Standard Version, the Common English Bible version, or something else, they are going to take the word tamim, and it can be translated as blameless, obedient, or trustworthy. It just depends upon the translation. And it's interesting that if you read it in those different ways, kind of how does it give us something else to understand the passage, like another layer, like an onion. When we're thinking about other cultures in this passage, we are going to be talking about circumcision. And it's important to know that the practice of circumcision was actually customary among the Western Semites and Egyptians, either as an initiation ritual or purely for hygienic reasons. So the ritual of circumcision is not unique to Abraham and Abraham's line alone. Some other interesting things to note about Genesis 17. The covenant here, it involves both the promise of heirs and the gathering of land. God speaks a lot in Genesis 17, and a statement of self-identification, right? Where God says, I am El Shaddai, verses 1 and 2, and in 3 distinct speeches apart from God's initial proclamation, which lay out the covenant and what it entails. Genesis 17 belongs to a small, though important group of long priestly compositions in Genesis, because a lot of Genesis is by the Yahwehist tradition. But it's important, right? Genesis 17. And this important group of priestly compositions, only 2 of which appear in the family literature. So these long periods or long verses, several verses of things. Scholars observe this as another version of the covenant between God and Abraham, the first being reported in Genesis 15 by the Yahwehists. So that's important to understand that we've got 2 versions of the covenant. And then the change from El Shaddai to Yahweh, which lies behind the usage in Genesis 17, may be relevant to this text in the change from the name Abram to Abraham, because in this chapter, we also get that aspect of Abram becomes Abraham. We get name changes. And when thinking about Abraham must be blameless or obedient or trustworthy so that God can make a covenant with him, we may go, can anybody be that? I mean, are you asking for perfections? But what we may infer is that Abraham's obedience to God's covenant, that this covenant is the way in which the blameless life should be lived. Like it's a particular way of living, that God is asking for a particular way for Abraham to conduct himself throughout life. The word covenant appears 13 times, and it is God's covenant, not Abraham's covenant. And we can understand covenant as promise. We get the Ishmaelites and the Edomites will ultimately stem from Abraham, as well as Israel and Judah. So when we're thinking about the heirs of Abraham and who this goes to and how does this work, that we recognize that with this passage that there are going to be multiple lines coming from Abraham. And this text reflects a time when the fulfillment of this promise was understood as having been best accomplished when these peoples were known to have been independent political entities. So we can think about different times where this may happen through the history of ancient Israel. This covenant has multiple ramifications, one of which involves the renaming of both Abram and Sarai. Abram, meaning great father, now becomes Abraham, father of many. So we can see the similarities and the connections. And then we get Sarai, which we don't really know the name, the meaning behind that name, but to Sarah, who now has the definition of royal woman. So we can understand those things about them where God is saying, I am changing something about you, an identity change, and it comes in the form of a name. But that name signifies something great and wonderful. In 17:8, God grants the land to Abraham and subsequently to those who follow him. The notion of Abraham actually possessing the land may not have been part of the earliest traditions. The fact that the priestly version of the covenant includes it may explain why this same author is so interested in describing the way in which Abraham actually acquires land. And we find in Genesis 23 the purchase of the Machpelah cave. It's important to think about, all right, so we're talking about possession of land, and it seems to be more important here, and that ends up being taken up in one of the ways that this passage gets misused. But before we even get to that, another important thing to note is God's second major speech spells out the implications of God's covenant with Abraham and heirs. God being with the general notion of keeping the covenant, but quickly moves to the focus of a single rite of circumcision. And the passage describes a penalty for the individual who is uncircumcised, that they are banished. And we get no other reference in this way, in this kind of severity of banishment elsewhere in the Old Testament. And it seems that for this particular passage, the presence of blood is essential for making the covenant. But that even as it is unique that there is the need for human blood, but it comes without involving death. And the priestly writer establishes the household as the context in which the circumcision takes place. Both the rites of circumcision and Passover, though boundary rituals, right, that are establishing the perimeter of the community, are open to those born outside the lineage of Terah being Abraham's father. And then Genesis 17 highlights the importance of circumcision for the lineage of Abraham. The remainder of the book remains silent. The remainder of the book actually remains silent about circumcision, and there is no reference to Isaac having Jacob or Esau circumcised, and no reference to Jacob having circumcised his 12 sons, and no reference to Joseph having circumcised Ephraim and Manasseh. So it's kind of interesting that here it's like it's being set up as important part of the covenant, and there's this ritual of circumcision, but then it kind of seems to almost stop, and it only comes back, like it's almost forgotten. It only comes back until the time of Moses. So it's kind of like forgotten, and then it comes back. And what makes circumcision crucial in the life of the people is that it binds them together. Even though the promise of land ceased to exist during the Babylonian captivity, which is probably when this writer is writing, and from the temple destruction in 70 until like 1948, right? So we're talking a very long period of time where it's actually not about the land, it's about the circumcision, and it's about bringing people together. And that God ceases to be tied to a piece of property or one specific geographical location. That's really kind of important, that God is not tied to a geographical location. Instead, wherever Abraham's children live in the world, God is present with them. And then we get verses 15 through 22 is God's final speeches. Though addressed to Abraham, it also concerns Sarah and the third major character in this chapter. The new promise to Sarah involves her becoming a mother to Abraham's son. She's going to be the source of nations and kings that God promised in the first speech. And that Abraham asked God to consider Ishmael. And that's really important. Abraham is very concerned about Ishmael, who already exists and who lives in the household and who will soon be circumcised. Abraham's like, well, why not Ishmael in the same way? And God's response builds on the rhetoric used in the earlier chapter. Ishmael, like Abraham and Sarah before him, will be blessed. He too will be fruitful. Ishmael too will become exceedingly great. But there are differences. So just to recognize there are differences amongst all of us. And Ishmael bears special status among those members of the family who are not part of the main line of descendants, like Moab, Ammon, Edom, like the peoples, the different groups. And then verses 23 through 27 accomplish at least three promises to demonstrate that Abraham will keep the covenant, that he acts to accomplish it quickly, and that Abraham's concern for Ishmael continues. And so that's really important to note. How has this passage been misused? Well, I kind of alluded to one of them about the land, and about sometimes that a passage like this and others are used to legitimize taking of land or possessing land. It's also been misused to say some people are not as good as others, or to diminish the worthiness and importance of others. What are some of the things that the text is trying to convey? Is that the passage is trying to help people understand the covenant, the promises of God to Abraham, and why the ritual of circumcision is important. Another thing it's trying to convey is the change of names by God is a signal of a change in identity for Abraham and Sarah, and this change is good. So why would any of this matter today? Well, it's helpful to kind of know when you hear certain things, whether that's in the news or historical, like where are these things coming from? And it's kind of helpful. Okay, well, you can get that. You can interpret that passage in a particular way. But here's some things that are really helpful for us. The passage is a reminder of that God's way of doing things is not our way, that God has a different way and that sometimes we understand it and sometimes we do not. It's also a recognition that God works in all of our lives in very different ways, because we're all different and we're all unique, and God works in all of our lives. And then it's also a passage where it should have us questioning, what are we willing to do to follow God's guidance, to live in peace, to love others, and to experience more joy? What are we willing to do to have those things, to live those things, and to share those things with others? And then a question of, how do we let God shape our identity? To really begin to think about that. Are we people of hope, joy, peace, love, forgiveness, compassion, healing? Are we people of integrity and honesty? Are we people of blessing and resilience and trustworthiness? And to recognize those things as being connected to God, and how God can shape our identity in really beautiful, wonderful ways. If we're willing to listen, if we're willing to follow, if we're willing to be guided. And that there are very good things. There's an abundance of beauty and goodness in this world, if we're willing to live into it, if we're willing to allow it to be part of our identity. So I hope you found this kind of interesting about Genesis 17. And as you read through it, or maybe have read through it, that new things come to light that help you ponder. Like, all right, what does this mean for my own life? And how do I understand the world and God's presence in the ways that I go through life, in the ways that I understand myself, in the ways that I even conduct myself? May your day be blessed.